Good evening, and welcome aboard Midnight Outcry. Tonight we set sail into the vast and unforgiving depths of the open sea, where luxury meets nightmare. These are 10 true cruise ship encounters that didn't end with cocktails and sunsets, but with terror, tragedy, and the kind of darkness that floats just below the surface, told by passengers, crew members, and seasoned maritime investigators. These are not spooky bedtime stories. They are documented accounts of real people trapped in real-life horrors, miles away from land, help, or any way out. From mysterious disappearances to unspeakable crimes, each case peels back the polished veneer of cruise ship luxury to reveal what the industry would rather you never see. Verified through Coast Guard reports, legal files, and eyewitness testimonies, these chilling tales expose the terrifying truth. Sometimes, the most beautiful places are the most dangerous. If you're new to Midnight Outcry, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon, because we bring you true horror every single night, and not the kind you can just wake up from. Let's get started. They haven't stopped since the horror began 3 weeks ago. Tyler's face from that last dinner, laughing at something absurd Kevin said about the buffet shrimp, comes to mind every time I close my eyes. At the time, I was a 26-year-old junior accountant living in a small Chicago apartment with 3 men who had become my best friends since college. For nearly 2 years, we had been accumulating money, asking for time off work, and all the other things in preparation for this Caribbean trip. Before 2 of us went away for new work, it was meant to be our big celebratory vacation. Josh, Tyler, Kevin, and I had reserved adjacent rooms on the Coral Princess's 7th deck. Josh used his camera to record everything. Kevin kept us grounded with his practical jokes, and Tyler was the one who was always pushing us to try new things. This cruise seemed like the ideal way to close up the chapter of our life that we had been friends with since our freshman year. The ship was large, one of those floating cities with many pools, restaurants, and entertainment areas. The first 2 days were devoted to touring, sampling various bars, and deciding which port excursions to reserve. Tyler got up really early to see the sunrise from the upper deck, which was a strange hobby of his. With his coffee and the battered journal he took with him everywhere, he had been doing it since day one. Whether it was taking pictures of the beach or jotting down weird musings about life, the man was concerned with capturing the ideal moments. Around 5 a.m. on the 3rd morning, he reported witnessing some crew members engaged in heated discussions close to the restricted areas. At breakfast, he made a joke about it, stating that it appeared they were talking about something important rather than simply standard ship business. Tyler kept bringing it up throughout the day, asking if we had seen anything odd about various employees, but we shrugged it off. It was that night when things began to feel different. Tyler appeared more perceptive than normal during our meal at the main restaurant, pointing out crew members he had seen on his morning walks and continuously scanning the dining area. We assumed that his analytical mind was simply growing bored when he began recording their rotations and shift changes. He whispered, leaning in close after dessert, that he had heard 2 cleaning staff members discussing another one in quick Spanish. However, they quickly changed the topic and turned to English when they saw he was listening. We all stopped talking when he described their response, the abrupt stillness, the anxious looks, and the hasty departure. After attending the late-night comedy show and spending the remainder of the night at the casino, we returned to our rooms at around 1 in the morning. As usual, we said each other goodnight through the adjacent door. Tyler was in room 7142, which was just next to me. For perhaps 20 minutes, I could hear him going about his daily business of opening drawers, shutting the water, and getting ready for bed. His TV switching to a late-night chat show was the last thing I heard, which wasn't strange because he frequently dozed off with it on. That night, the sea was especially choppy, and the ship's rocking actually accelerated my sleep. At 6:47 a.m., I began to hear someone beating on my door. I looked at the digital clock, dazed and disoriented, wondering why cleaning would be so combative at such an early hour, yet I know the precise time. It wasn't housekeeping, though. Josh and Kevin were there, talking over each other and appearing to be in a hurry. In order to surprise Tyler with coffee and pastries from the breakfast buffet, they had gone to his room. However, he He was absent. He had not yet made his bed. Fresh writing from the previous evening was in his journal, which was open on the desk. The drapes were fluttering in the morning wind, and his balcony door was ajar. He still had his coffee maker ready for his customary 5 a.m. The timer never went off, but it was routine. After calling ship security right away, crew members began to fill our hallway in a matter of minutes. Our statements were taken with what appeared to be practiced speed by Captain Martinez, the stern woman in charge of security. She inquired about Tyler's mental health, including whether he had been drinking excessively and whether he had a history of depression or sleepwalking. It seemed as though she had practiced her queries a lot. Her attitude changed a little when we brought up Tyler's insights on crew talks and his propensity to explore restricted places. She became more official, explaining that Tyler had probably had a bad accident during his early morning routine and that passengers occasionally misunderstand normal operating discussions. 2 hours later, the ship was announced. There was a minute of quiet after a sobering announcement about a passenger who had gone overboard during the night. Here's what troubled me, though. In reality, they never conducted a complete search of the ship. No methodical room-by-room inspection. There was no notice asking other travelers if they had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Rather, they immediately went into their overboard protocol, using binoculars to survey the ocean surface and calling the Coast Guard. Captain Martinez clarified that the deck cameras had been undergoing maintenance when Josh proposed that they see the security footage from those cameras. Her explanation came too swiftly, as if she had planned it beforehand, and the timing seemed impossible. The three of us were sitting in the main room that afternoon, trying to figure out what had happened, when we heard a conversation that confirmed our suspicions. At an adjacent table, 2 crew workers, a maintenance worker, and a guest services representative were having a quiet conversation, presumably thinking we couldn't hear them above the background noise. The maintenance guy noted the third one this season and how they needed to be more careful about picking the appropriate individuals. He was quickly quieted by the guest services representative, who reminded him that management is in charge of the paperwork and that their only responsibility was to keep the timetable in order. They quickly stopped talking and started walking away in different directions when they realized we were listening. The remainder of the day was devoted to our discreet investigation, during which we spoke with other travelers and inquired casually if they had observed anything out of the ordinary. Around 2 a.m., an elderly couple from Texas informed us that they had overheard a fight on the deck above them. However, they only saw crew personnel cleaning equipment when they peered out their balcony. One woman who was traveling alone reported that the previous evening, she had seen someone being escorted through the service hallways, but she had assumed that it was simply a drunken traveler being assisted to their room. All of the stories we heard described late-night activities that were inconsistent with regular cruise operations. The crew's replies were progressively inconsistent when we asked follow-up questions concerning their procedures and protocols. Our final night on board the cruise was the tipping point. Josh had been recording everything on his phone, including pictures, notes, and chats, and he intended to get in touch with the police when we got to port. His door was knocked on at about 11 o'clock in the evening. 2 crew members said they had to check his room for reported maintenance problems when he opened it. When Josh declined, they presented him an official-looking document concerning required safety checks. They were kind but persistent. His phone unexpectedly vanished from his nightstand as they were inspecting his room. After 20 minutes, the crew members departed after finding nothing amiss, but Josh's evidence was gone. Later, Captain Martinez volunteered to assist him in submitting a lost property claim, explaining that phones might occasionally be lost in choppy waters. Knowing that we would never truly know what had happened to Tyler, we disembarked the following morning feeling both sad and frustrated. 2 weeks later, the cruise line issued us an official letter of condolence, explaining that their inquiry had found Tyler had gone overboard while going about his morning routine. In addition to asking us to sign a statement admitting their extensive research, they enclosed a tiny reimbursement check. We didn't sign it. We discovered that Tyler wasn't the only passenger to go missing from that specific ship, and Kevin instead located a maritime attorney who focuses on cruise ship mishaps. Over the previous 3 years, there had been at least 6 instances like this. all determined to be unintentional, involving travelers who had been inquiring or investigating forbidden regions. The cruise line has strong legal staff, and the majority of mishaps occur in international waters, where jurisdiction becomes complex. But the lawyer is still putting together a case. Every day, I worry if Tyler found something that would have made him hazardous to their organization, and if the truth about what actually happened that night will ever be revealed. I will always be haunted by what transpired on that cruise ship. I'm a 34-year-old Denver accountant who reserved a spot on the Ocean Majesty for a leisurely week in the Caribbean last September. I had finally received the promotion I had been pursuing after working 60-hour weeks for 2 years at my company, and my doctor had begun making scathing remarks about my stress levels at my yearly physical. The vacation appeared to be the ideal cure. 7 days of no spreadsheets at all, poolside relaxation, and limitless food. Although I had never taken a cruise before, the brochure presented it as a floating paradise with plenty of entertainment options, numerous dining options, and enormous pools. My expectations were fulfilled during the first 3 days. I read a paperback novel on deck 7 in the mornings, wandering the ship's infinite hallways in the afternoons and dining at various restaurants in the nights. The splendor of the ocean resembled a floating metropolis. With decks that seemed to go on forever, there were around 4,000 passengers and crew. I became friends with Janet and Robert, a retired couple from Portland who had taken numerous cruises and were always pointing me the best places on the ship. 3 tables away in the dining area, Janet's contagious laugh could be heard. Additionally, Robert consistently donned these absurd Hawaiian shirts that somehow made him appear distinguished. We had made it a habit to get together for breakfast every morning at the Serenity Deck restaurant, which had great coffee and breathtaking views of the ocean. However, everything changed on Wednesday morning, the 4th. Around 6:30 a.m., I woke up to this strange feeling. It was a different ship. It was more irregular, almost jerky, than the soft rocking motion I had grown accustomed to. Additionally, the engines had a distinct sound, as if they were exerting more effort than normal. Perhaps we were experiencing some severe weather, I reasoned. However, the ocean appeared to be rather quiet as I drew back the curtains on my balcony door. We had been largely alone on the open sea for the last 3 days, so it was uncommon to see multiple other ships in the distance when the early sun cast this lovely golden path across the water. Assuming Janet and Robert would have some explanation for the ship's peculiar conduct, I changed and went to join them for breakfast. There was tension in the air as I got to the restaurant. There were no loud voices, and I saw a number of crew members clustered close to the coffee station, whispering urgently to each other. Already seated at our customary table, Janet and Robert appeared concerned rather than their normal upbeat morning chatter. Today, Robert's face was pale behind his vacation tan, but his Hawaiian shirt was a vibrant orange with pom-poms. Janet wasn't even laughing. She was looking out the window at those far-off ships while holding her coffee cup in both hands. She leaned over and whispered that she had heard some unsettling tales from other passengers as soon as I sat down. Some of the crew members appeared to be genuinely worried about our destination, and it seemed that some were claiming that the ship had taken an unexpected course throughout the night. Captain Harrison's voice came into life over the ship's intercom at about 900 in the morning. Typically, he used this deep, commanding voice to announce dinner reservations and entertainment schedules. He sounded stressed this time, though. He declared that all passengers had to go back to their cabins immediately and stay there until further notice because of navigational changes. A straightforward command that chilled the entire dining area was given without any justification or time estimate. The crew members who had been whispering abruptly jumped into action, guiding passengers toward the elevators in a kind but strong manner. I observed families with small children gathering their possessions, their faces displaying fear and bewilderment. When a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, repeatedly asked her mother why they couldn't go to the pool, her mother just responded, "Soon, sweetheart," in a tone that didn't seem to be persuaded. It felt like a funeral march as I made my way back to my cabin. After 3 days of joy and laughing, the ship's halls were suddenly eerily quiet, save for the sound of footfall and anxious murmurs. On my way to the elevator, I passed the main deck and noticed something that made my chest constrict. The ships in the distance were neither commercial nor recreational. They were military ships, and they were getting closer. I saw uniformed figures moving on their decks, and their gray hulls sliced purposefully across the sea. What appeared to be mounted equipment glinted in the morning sun gear that was very clearly not for transporting or fishing. Desperate to get to my cabin and try to make sense of what was happening, I hit the elevator button repeatedly. As soon as my cabin was secured, I ran straight to my balcony and looked through the glass door. My pulse was pounding since I could now see details of the military ships up close. At least 4 ships surrounded us in what appeared to be a perimeter, and each one was flying a crimson flag with an unidentifiable symbol that was difficult to read from a distance. I saw armed soldiers moving about on the deck of the largest ship, which had what looked like a helicopter landing pad. I could hear other travelers speaking in quiet, terrified tones through the walls of my cabin. I could hear a man's voice attempting to console the woman who was crying in the cabin next to mine. The ship's engines were now nearly silent, and we were merely floating along with these military ships, keeping their places around us as if we were a valuable asset they were protecting. Around 11 a.m., the intercom crackled once more, but it wasn't Captain Harrison. Through the speakers came a voice I didn't know, speaking with a foreign accent. His comments chilled me to the bone. He introduced himself as Commander Valdez of the Maritime Defense Force. He declared that the Ocean Majesty was currently under military escort after entering restricted territorial seas without permission. While the matter was being handled diplomatically, all passengers were to stay in their cabins. He sounded more like freight than humans when he stated, "Resolved." There was a spooky silence over the ship when the announcement was over. Even the typical water sounds sounded muffled, as if everyone was holding their breath, anticipating what would come next. Without any developments, the hours passed slowly. The line was busy when I attempted to call the main desk. I tried to connect to my family using the ship's Wi-Fi, but the internet was down. I could see the military ship standing their ground, never more than a few hundred yards away, via the door of my balcony. Around 2 p.m., I heard multiple helicopters flying overhead, their rotors making a loud boom that shook the ship as a whole. As I put my face against the glass, I noticed them flying like mechanical vultures over us. I could see uniformed figures descending down ropes onto the upper deck of our ship from one helicopter, which was far larger than the others. It was all horrifyingly true when we saw armed soldiers actually boarding our ship. This was not a simple miscommunication that could be resolved over the phone. We were indeed caught in the midst of a global crisis. The uncertainty was the worst. Neither the nature of the situation nor its duration was known. The old couple across the hall from me were arguing angrily over whether or not to try to leave their room, and I could hear children sobbing in other cabins. While his wife pleaded with him not to do anything that might worsen the situation, the guy persisted in claiming they had rights as citizens of the United States. Around 4:00 p.m., I heard footsteps in the corridor. The typical crew wore soft, cheap shoes, but these were heavy boots. Someone's door was knocked on sharply, and then there was a muffled conversation in what sounded like Spanish. Then there was another knock nearer my chamber. I could feel the thumping of my heart in my throat. I was petrified when the knock on my door arrived, terrified to answer but also terrified of the consequences if I didn't. When I opened the door at last, I saw a young woman named Lisa, who had been serving drinks at the pool bar the day before, standing in the corridor with a uniformed soldier. Lisa's normally cheerful smile had been replaced by barely controlled panic, and she looked scared. In very accented English, the soldier asked for my identification while comparing room numbers to a list. His gear appeared serious and operational, and his uniform was clean and military-specific, with patches I didn't identify. He looked at my passport, then just nodded and went to the next door. Lisa briefly drew my attention, and before they moved on down the hallway, I saw her utter the word, "sorry." In some way, that little encounter gave everything greater substance. Seeing a person I had laughed with a few days before turned into a scared tour guide for international military personnel. when Captain Harrison's voice came back over the intercom at about 7:00 p.m. He sounded quite different. Something that verged on defeat took the place of his customary tone of confidence. He declared that diplomatic talks were still in progress, and that the ship had, in fact, entered contested territorial seas as a result of what he described as navigational errors. He reassured us that we should maintain our composure and patience, since our safety came first. Then he spoke something that numbingly affected every part of my body. He explained that our current situation was caused by a decision to change the ship's initial course in order to maximize fuel efficiency. As the ramifications of his remarks became clear to me, I understood that someone had deliberately chosen to bypass restricted waterways in order to save money. And 4,000 individuals were now bearing the consequences. Armed troops patrolled our decks, and military warships held their positions throughout the night as the standoff continued. After what I later found out were lengthy diplomatic talks, we were freed the following morning. Nevertheless, within weeks, the cruise line discreetly settled complaints and dismissed Captain Harrison. I'll never forget the sensation of being utterly helpless in the middle of the ocean, caught between global politics and corporate avarice, even though I never found out exactly which country's seas we had invaded. I was always on the road as a pharmaceutical sales representative, but the Mediterranean cruise was going to be something new. This was my first actual vacation in 3 years. At the age of 28, I felt as though I had been living out of hotel rooms throughout the Midwest and completing transactions for months. I gave myself the cruise as a birthday present, 7 days of total detachment from conference calls and spreadsheets. The Celestial Horizon was my first choice because of its stellar reputation for exquisite dining and opulent amenities. With almost 4,000 passengers, the ship was enormous. Nevertheless, with its marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers that reflected the Mediterranean sunlight in dazzling prisms, it nevertheless felt personal. Our third day at sea, shortly after we had departed the port of Barcelona, was when the crisis began. On deck 12, I had been anticipating supper at the ship's most upscale eatery, Palazzo Nero. I had to pay an additional $200 for the reservation, but the reviews said the food would be amazing. I was placed at a corner table overlooking the infinite ocean by the maitre, a tall man with silver hair and an Italian accent. The atmosphere was ideal. Candles glowing over white tablecloths, soft jazz music, and the ship's soft sway all combined to create an almost hypnotic rhythm. I believed the Soumeyer's advice and ordered the chef's tasting menu, which included 7 meals matched with wines I had never heard of. From the amuse-bouche until the last course, a delicate panna cotta that melted on my tongue like silk, everything appeared to be perfect. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when the first indicators appeared. I woke up with a mild headache, a nauseous feeling in my stomach, and what I initially believed to be motion sickness. However, I became aware that this was different as I lay in my cabin and listened to the ship's engines buzzing below. I had to cuddle up in my small bed because of the painful pains that accompanied the waves of nausea. I had previously been on cruise ships, but I had never had seasickness this bad. A cold perspiration appeared on my brow, and the chamber seemed to be spinning faster than the ship's normal motion. My stomach emptied rapidly as I staggered to the restroom, nearly making it. It tasted sour and metallic, nothing like the fine lunch I had eaten hours before. In between retching, I could hear muffled moans, similar noises from nearby cabins, and the distinct sound of other people being ill. The ship's medical area was overcrowded by dawn. A line of pale, trembling individuals stretched down the corridor as I made my way to deck 5, having managed to get clothed. The ship's physician, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a look of obvious worry on her face, was rushing between patients. I heard her discussing the very high volume of patients they were seeing in a whispered conversation with a nurse. Overnight, over 60 people reported experiencing identical problems. The pattern was what I found strange. The night before, everyone who had become unwell had eaten at Palazzo Nero. The other eateries on the ship, the buffet, the steakhouse, even the casual pizza joint. Their customers appeared to be doing just fine. I watched as more people, some so frail they required assistance walking, staggered in as I waited for almost 2 hours. We were repeatedly assured by the ship's crew that it was simply a stomach ailment, which is common during cruises. However, their apprehensive looks and whispered chatter indicated they were aware that this was anything but typical. Over the course of the following day, things quickly got worse. What had begun as a serious case of food sickness soon turned into something much darker. After their health worsened, 3 passengers, a young mother traveling with her teenage daughter and an elderly couple from Ohio, were transferred to the ship's intensive care unit. They were experiencing more than just gastroenteritis. They were suffering from neurological issues, irregular heartbeats, and extreme dehydration, as the medical team discreetly explained. Amanda, a nurse I had become friendly with during my frequent visits to the medical ward, told me this information. She had been with the cruise line for 8 years working the night shift and was able to recognize when anything was really amiss. She whispered to me during one of our conversations that the blood tests were revealing high levels of toxins, which she had never observed in normal cases of food poisoning. On the 4th day, the ship's captain finally spoke to the passengers, his voice piercing the intercom system with hardly disguised tension. He declared that all impacted guests would receive complete medical attention and reimbursement as part of their inquiry into the isolated incident at Palazzo Nero. But as I glanced around the ship and noticed the increasing number of locked cabin doors and vacant deck seats, his comments seemed hollow. Everything about the atmosphere had changed. It felt like a jail now, when there had been a floating paradise. Unaffected passengers murmured among themselves in small clusters, glancing suspiciously at passing crewmen. Most individuals were too scared to eat anything other than sealed food they had brought from home, so the dining halls were half empty. I observed that there was more security on board the ship. Guards were positioned at the gates to previously open but restricted locations. The way the personnel behaved had also altered. When they believed that passengers were not paying attention, they spoke in low voices and avoided making eye contact, moving with jittery efficiency. On the 5th day, there was a breakthrough that wasn't related to the official investigation. I heard a furious argument by 2 cleaning staff members while I was seated in the library, one of the ship's few remaining peaceful areas. Although they were chatting quickly in Spanish, I was able to understand snippets of their conversation because, to my undergraduate coursework, they spoke of Venza's and Carlos' retaliation. They had told management about his behavior months prior, according to one of them, who kept shaking her head. They left as soon as they realized I was listening, but not before I heard their name. Carlos Mendoza, a sous chef who had been working in the kitchen of Palazzo Nero. Later, Amanda verified my suspicions. Carlos has received numerous reprimands for his behavior toward both management and passengers. Just weeks before our vacation, he had apparently been passed up for a promotion to head chef, a role that went to someone with more people skills but less experience. The parts started to fit together with a startling clarity. During that Tuesday evening service, Carlos had deliberately tainted some dishes, focusing on the priciest menu items that were exclusively ordered by Palazzo Nero patrons who paid. The accuracy required, however, was what made this even more terrifying. He had miraculously avoided poisoning other crew members or diners from other restaurants, indicating that this was a planned attack rather than an angry outburst. Amanda informed me that they had discovered evidence of industrial cleaning solvent combined with a typical culinary component, which would cover up the taste but seriously harm the internal organs. The insight struck me like a blow to the body. We had more than simply food poisoning. One man's perverse attempt at retaliation against the cruise line claimed our lives. Knowing that Carlos was still on board, still cooking, still pacing the halls as passengers suffered as a result of his willful activities, was the worst part. After I came to terms with the reality, the paranoia became oppressive. Each crew member turned into a possible danger. Each meal is a potential weapon. I began to notice things that I had never noticed before. The manner some employees avoided making eye contact. How certain people appeared to know more than they were disclosing. Little conflicts that exist between various departments. Through the glass barrier, I observed the kitchen crew during dinner service, observing their motions and speculating about the possible involvement of others. Were there other workers who weren't happy? Was this a component of a wider plot, or had Carlos acted alone? I was so preoccupied with the questions that I was unable to unwind or take enjoyment in the little things in life. I started stockpiling food from the gift store that I could be sure were in sealed packaging. As I lay in my cabin listening to every step in the hallway, I found it difficult to fall asleep. I worried that someone may interfere with the ventilation system or put something beneath my door. Once a floating palace, the ship now seemed like a labyrinth of possible threats. Day 6 was the pivotal moment when I saw something that validated my worst suspicions. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I was strolling by the crew quarters in the hopes that the night air on deck would help me relax. I caught Carlos chatting animatedly with 2 other staff members I didn't recognize through a partially open door. I was so cold because of the contented look on his face. It was the face of someone who had done exactly what he had set out to achieve, not of someone who had made a horrible mistake. I heard bits of Spanish mixed with English as he gestured toward the passenger areas and the higher decks. He said something about showing them what happens when you don't respect us, and teaching them a lesson. The other crew members became uneasy. One of them backed up from the chat and shook his head, but Carlos kept talking, his voice becoming more enthusiastic and self-satisfied. That's when I understood he had absolutely no regret. He felt pleased of himself for having successfully retaliated against the cruise line and its passengers. The loneliness of being stranded at sea made things more difficult, even though I knew I had to take action. I told Amanda what I had heard and seen the following morning. She confirmed that Carlos had been assigned to run the kitchen during our disastrous dinner service, while she listened in increasing dread. We all agreed to call the authorities directly rather than the ship's security, who might be compromised or just inept. Amanda assisted me in calling the Coast Guard using the ship's satellite communication system, giving them comprehensive details regarding Carlos's identification, his motivation, and the proof we had collected. It was a prompt and decisive answer. Our ship was captured by a Coast Guard cutter within hours, and federal agents boarded to apprehend Carlos. Most passengers were unaware that the arrest was taking place because it happened so swiftly. They merely observed more security guards navigating the ship with deliberate efficiency. After Carlos was taken into custody, the matter was resolved quickly. He admitted to purposefully poisoning the meals with industrial cleaning chemicals after being confronted with overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of other crew members who had previously been reluctant to speak up. According to the inquiry, he had been preparing this attack for weeks, carefully researching the restaurant's protocols and timing his activities to inflict the most damage. We received appropriate care for the chemical poisoning. After all, impacted passengers were promptly evacuated to a medical center in Naples. The cruise line eventually declared bankruptcy after being the target of numerous lawsuits. More significantly, though, Carlos was found guilty of bioterrorism and attempted murder and given a 15-year sentence in federal prison. After receiving treatment for a few weeks, I entirely healed. The experience taught me that evil may lurk behind the most commonplace appearances, and that often the greatest risk comes from people who believe they have nothing left to lose, even though I will never be able to enjoy exquisite dining in the same way again. Even now, I make sure to check the seals on my food containers and steer clear of eateries where the kitchen is hidden from view. Even when justice is done, some worries never go away. Although it wasn't exactly my ideal employment, working the night shift as a pool deck supervisor on the Celestial Voyager was sufficient to support me while I completed my degree in marine biology. 2019 spring has been a long one. Cruise season is in full gear, with youngsters yelling during the day and an unsettling quiet that descends on the pool decks after dusk. When no one was looking, I would occasionally steal a snack from the passenger buffets and eat any leftovers I could find in the crew massal while bunking in a small crew quarter on Deck 3. I was 22 years old. Under the dim deck lights, I would mostly spend my shift reading textbooks. Occasionally, I would patrol the perimeter to look for any passengers attempting to sneak in for a midnight swim or any equipment problems. After 11 p.m., all access to the pool areas was prohibited. That was made very obvious by ship policy, particularly while we were at sea. The isolation was what made the work tolerable. I had the whole aquatic complex to myself during those peaceful hours between midnight and 6 in the morning. The Olympic-sized lap pool, which was set aside for serious swimmers and morning water aerobics courses, the main pool, the cat splash area, and the hot tubs. After spending the entire day navigating the mayhem of families and inebriated travelers, the quiet was almost restorative. On a deck chair by the main pool, I would set up my small command center. There was a thermos of coffee that would keep me going all night, and textbooks arranged on a little table. The faint hoo of water from the filtering systems completing their rounds, the occasional creak of the hull, and the soft hum of the ship's engines down below were the only sounds audible. It was quiet, steady, and just what I needed to concentrate on my studies and make a respectable living during the cruise season. On a Wednesday night in late July, everything changed. By then, I had been working there for approximately 3 months and had become accustomed to coming in at 11:45 p.m., completing my first safety check and then getting right into my schoolwork. The pool deck retained the warmth of the day long after the sun had set, and the weather had been ideal that week. I recall the pool lights illuminating the water's surface with their recognizable blue hue as I settled into my chair with my organic chemistry textbook. That day had been quite busy on the ship. After extensive use, maintenance had to make adjustments, as evidenced by the strewn pool toys and the somewhat higher chlorine levels. Now, however, at almost 1 in the morning, the place was as empty as it was every other night. When I heard it, I was in the middle of a chapter on molecular structures. There was a noticeable splash coming from the lap pool's direction. Like a dagger through quiet, the sound sliced through the ship's engines. Steady beat. Because of the ship's modest rocking motion, I initially assumed it was just one of the robotic pool cleaners, striking the pool wall a bit more forcefully than usual. The maintenance staff had to continually modify their programming to take into consideration the ship's movement and prevent those objects from being trapped in corners or creating excessive noise, because sometimes they had a mind of their own. I then heard it once more, followed by a sound that was definitely someone gasping for air. The sound, which reverberated off the metal walls and roof of the enclosed pool area, was so obviously human, frantic, frightened breathing that it sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight from the equipment bag, closed my textbook, and got to my feet. A beautiful wall of faux palm trees and tropical flora partially obscured the lap pool, which was about 50 yards away. I screamed out the usual warning that the pool was closed as I approached the sound, my deck shoes squeaking a little on the damp, non-slip surface. There was no answer, only the ongoing splashing and those terrible gasping noises that seemed to reverberate off the ship's hull. My heart almost stopped when I turned the corner and shone my spotlight at the lap pool. There was nothing in the water. There was no pool cleaner running, no one in the area, and nothing to explain the sounds I could clearly hear. The ship was sailing steadily through calm waters, yet the water itself was moving, strong ripples spreading across the surface like someone flailing around in the deep end. The gasping sounds seemed to be coming from right above the churning water, and they were louder now, more desperate. For what seemed like an eternity, I stood there looking behind the starting blocks, studying the pool deck for any indication of an intruder, and sweeping my flashlight beam across every inch of the pool. After about another half hour, the noises ceased suddenly, and the lake returned to its typical mirror-like stillness. The ensuing hush was deafening. It appeared as though the entire ship was holding its breath, including the normal hum of the engines. The following hour was devoted to conducting a comprehensive search of the whole pool complex, looking in every maintenance room, hiding place, and crevice where someone might have hidden. I even reported a potential trespasser to ship security. However, by the time Officer Brennan showed up, I had nothing to show him save my own paranoia. He accompanied me on a perimeter walk, inspected the secured access doors, and verified that every security camera was operational. Later, the video from that night would show me chatting to nothing while wandering around with my flashlight pointed at an empty pool. When Brennan mentioned that I might have heard sounds coming from the lower deck pools or perhaps the ship's hull settling in the waves, I could see the suspicion in his eyes, even though he was being professional about it. But I was aware of what I had heard. It was obviously out of the ordinary and emanated from our lap pool. Ship noises or my imagination couldn't account for the sound. It was too real, too frantic, and too human. I couldn't get those desperate gasping sounds out of my head, but the next few nights went by without any problems. Every time the filtration system made a small sound or the ship's hull sliced through the waves, I couldn't help but look toward the lap pool. I made an effort to tell myself it was simply finals week stress, perhaps too much coffee, but I knew better in my heart. Then, during our shift change around a week later, I was speaking with Nancy, one of the day shift supervisors. Having worked on cruise ships for nearly 15 years, she was an experienced worker who was well-versed in the fleet's history and rumors. Her expression suddenly shifted when I casually mentioned the strange noises I'd been hearing at night. She pulled me away by the equipment storage area after checking to make sure no one else was listening. It was then that she told me about the events of a crossing that took place in the spring of 2017, something that has been wiped out of the official documents. In what should have been a lighthearted hazing ceremony, two young men, both college students on their first contract on the ship, had perished in that same lap pool. They were Nathan and Benjamin, both 19 years old from small Midwest towns, and they had never worked on a cruise ship. Nancy claims that one night on a sea day, some off-duty crew members decided to start the new guys out with a bizarre swimming challenge after drinking too much. They had supposedly tied weights to the boys' ankles and made them swim laps while the others timed them and cheered them on from the pool deck, but the specifics were unclear. When Benjamin and Nathan both slipped under and never came back up, what had begun as harmless fun turned fatal. The other crew members couldn't mount a successful rescue because they were too inebriated and in a panic. It was also too late by the time they succeeded in removing the bodies. In order to ensure that the incident never made it into any official report or news coverage, the cruise line's legal staff acted quickly, paying off families and threatening litigation. As she concluded the narrative, NY's voice was hardly audible above a whisper, and her eyes darted around anxiously as if she was waiting for a management representative to show there and stop her. She informed me that a number of crew members had resigned right away following the incident because they couldn't bear the guilt and subsequent cover-up. The directly engaged staff members had been quietly let go with large severance payouts and non-disclosure agreements, or reassigned to other ships. Nancy felt that the next port stop had been more about removing evidence than keeping the pool clean, but even the pool itself had been thoroughly drained, cleaned, and replaced with fresh water. The fact that Nathan and Benjamin had both been proficient swimmers was what plagued her the most. Nathan had been a lifeguard at a neighborhood pool back home, while Benjamin had been on the swim team in high school. The drowning was not a common occurrence for them. However, in the confines of that ship's pool, the mix of weighted restrictions, drink, and peer pressure had produced a perfect storm of catastrophe. The sounds I had been hearing had a whole new meaning after hearing that story. Waiting for those frantic, gasping sounds to return made every night shift an exercise in controlled horror. And they always came back at the same time, from the lap pool, and they always stayed silent for just long enough to make my skin crawl. I began recording everything. Everything that could assist me make sense of what was happening, including the precise times, the length of the sounds, the location of the ship, and the weather. The consistency of the pattern was uncanny. Around 12:45 in the morning, the noises would start. They always begin with splashing and progress to those awful gasping noises, lasting roughly 2 to 3 minutes. I even attempted to record them using my phone, but the audio files were utterly silent, capturing only my own anxious breathing and the background roar of the ship's engines. Whatever was going on seemed to exist in a realm beyond the reach of technology. A sweltering Friday night in early August was the tipping point. I was beginning to doubt my sanity because the noises had been increasing in frequency, sometimes occurring twice in a single shift. We were cruising through calm waters between ports that night, and I made the decision to set up shop right next to the lap pool before the regular time. I positioned a chair at the edge of the pool, prepared my flashlight, and waited, determined to see what was actually happening. The gasping sound started as soon as the water at the deep end started to churn rapidly at precisely 12:47 a.m. This time, however, I could almost make out words since they were so obvious and frantic. It seemed as though someone was trying to cry out for assistance but was having trouble breathing. They sounded like they were suffocating on water that didn't exist. The insight struck me like a blow to the body. I could hear the last moments of Nathan and Benjamin replayed over and over in an interminable cycle. I started crying because the dread in those screams was so genuine and unadulterated. Not out of fear, but rather from the deep sorrow of two young lives cut short by brutality and ignorance. That's when I decided what to do. I couldn't allow this to go on. Not for whatever remained of Nathan and Benjamin, and not for my own mental health. When we got in port the following day, I did as much research as I could on the two victims, finding the social media accounts and local newspapers their relatives had left as a tribute. At an internet cafe, I printed out their pictures and composed a brief message expressing regret for what had happened to them and admitting that their passing had not been forgotten. I put the message and pictures on the pool deck by the deep end that evening, along with 2 little bouquets of flowers I had been able to purchase from a vendor at our last port. I spent hours sitting there discussing Benjamin and Nathan with the empty pool, sharing details about my life, my education, and my aspirations to work as a marine biologist. I assured them that I would ensure their narrative was heard and that hush money and legal threats would not be used to cover up their deaths. That night the sounds ceased, and during the next few weeks I was on board the Heavenly Explorer. It never came again. At last the pool and I were at peace. After a difficult year, I booked the trip as a means to start over. My sister had recently relocated across the nation. Everything seemed to be stuck when I was in between jobs. I was persuaded by a buddy that a week at sea may help me decompress. I therefore took advantage of a discount on a mid-sized cruise line that sailed from Galveston. The ship included the standard amenities, like a dining hall, a casino, bars strewn across the decks, and a pool deck, but it was a mid-tier choice rather than a huge one with water slides and zip lines. I went alone with the idea that I would read, write in my journal, and perhaps talk to some strangers. I didn't anticipate becoming involved in anything strange. This is definitely not the case. I had settled into a pleasant little routine on the second day. Evenings were spent at the lounge at the stern, afternoons by the pool, and mornings spent exploring the upper decks with coffee, soft jazz, dim lighting, and Ellis, a surprisingly good bartender. It appeared that everyone knew him. He exuded the effortless charm of someone who has worked there for years. Silky but never phony. After one order, you always remember your drink and are good with names. He would make jokes, inquire about your day, and surprise you with small praise. Someone who gave you the impression that you were right where you should be. I began to go there more frequently because of the environment, as well as the drinks. It was comfortable and removed from the throng. There weren't many of us at the bar one evening. I was traveling with an older man and his adult daughter, along with a couple from Vermont. We spent a significant amount of time talking, and I recall Ellis giggling at one of my ridiculous tales about a failed Tinder match. As he handed me the tab, he smirked and leaned in to say, "You'd be surprised how many disasters start with good cocktails." As usual, I used my card to make the purchase, without even looking at it before putting it back in my wallet. Things didn't start to seem odd until 2 days later. My bank had sent me a notification when we were anchored in Beach. Something about a Miami boutique fee. It had been months since I had visited the Miami area. I initially dismissed it, thinking it was a bug, or perhaps a reoccurring issue that I had overlooked. Then another charge appeared though. This time, it's an Orlando gas station. The tension began to build at that point. I used the program to lock my card right away, but as I was doing so, I kept playing back my previous shipboard purchases. That lounge bar was the only place I had used the card, and only with Ellis. I initially remained silent back on the ship. Without evidence, I didn't want to start making accusations. I still harbored the hope that it was a coincidence. Before I even boarded, my card might have been skimmed. However, I also heard a couple at the next table chatting about strange expenditures on their credit card later that evening during supper. They claimed to have only used it once at the ship's bar and were attempting to determine how they had been hit. I softly stepped in to inquire which one it was. I felt as though a silent alarm went off in my head when they mentioned the one near the jazz lounge in the back. Same bartender, same location. I went to guest services the following morning to report it. The woman at the counter didn't even blink, which surprised me, because I half expected them to dismiss me or blame some overseas vendor. She made some inquiries. Which bar? On what day? Who was at work? And then excused herself to speak with someone behind a door that was covered in ice. Her tone had changed by the time she returned. She thanked me and mentioned that my information was useful and that they had already been looking at some of the problems. It dawned on me then that this was not a singular incident. It wasn't just me. It wasn't even brand new. Word began to travel more quickly than anyone could stop it. Rumors on board are difficult to ignore, much like smoke in a closed room. All of a sudden, people began muttering names and buzzing in corners as they took out their phones to check their banks. Ellis's name was repeated to me. According to a woman from Deck 6, her husband was spotted handling their card while holding his phone for an extended period of time. Ellis always turned slightly away when swiping, as if obstructing the view, according to another person. But nobody wanted to believe it. He was too normal, too nice. However, you stop acting as though they are random when too many dots begin to connect. They shut down the bar that evening. Just a sign that read, temporarily unavailable, with no explanation. People were tense, and Ellis was nowhere to be seen. Everyone sensed something had gone down, even if the ship made no formal announcements. Outside the staff corridor, close to the lower decks, I heard two officers conversing softly. A tablet was clutched by one of them. I swear, it looked like stills from a security camera, but I was only able to get a glance. Red rings are painted around a person's phone-holding hand next to a credit card terminal in screenshots that are stopped in mid-motion. There was an odd tension that pervaded the remainder of the journey. They were courteous, but cautious. Talks seemed to be shorter. Eyes stayed on the crew longer. Ellis never appeared in my life again. Furthermore, nobody would openly discuss what had happened to him. But in the silence, there were rumors. According to one story, he had been discreetly taken to the next port. Another said that after seeing the security tape, he had admitted to everything. According to someone, his phone included dozens of pictures, cards, names, numbers, and expiration dates up close. The trust was lost, regardless of the truth. I kept mentally reliving our exchanges. He grinned all those times. His easygoing manner, his quips, and the times when you thought he genuinely cared. I was moved by that. The theft wasn't the only thing. It was the manner in which he gave you a sense of security. There were levels to the deception. The acidic flavor lingered long after I disembarked from the ship because it was almost lovely. He was more than just a money thief. He employed trust as a tactic. The cruise line sent a vague email of apologies after I returned to the mainland, thanking passengers for their cooperation and promising that the issue had been rectified in compliance with legal and marine norms. The bogus charges were easily repaid by my bank, but I never received a clear response regarding the number of individuals impacted. Some estimated over 100, while others stated dozens. We'll never know the exact amount, in my opinion. He had likely been doing it for several months, if not longer. Perhaps he wasn't alone at all. I still don't use my card at bars, especially when I'm on a cruise. I also keep one eye on the charmer and the other on their hands if someone is getting too friendly too quickly. Sometimes I still think about the journey. The gnawing knowledge that the guy pouring your drink might be pocketing something else totally is more important than the beaches or sunsets. Worst of all, you most likely thanked him for it. Here I am at 2 in the morning, wide awake, and the events of that cruise last month are still on my mind. Maybe writing it down will help me process things because I can't stop thinking about it. I'm a 34-year-old Phoenix-based accountant. And to be honest, finding a good parking space at the mall is frequently the most exciting thing that occurs in my life. For months, my wife Jessica had been pleading with me to take a vacation, claiming that I seemed ready to burn out entirely. She was not mistaken. During tax season, I had been working 12-hour days for 3 months in a row. I thought, why not? When she came across this 7-day Caribbean cruise offer online. November was the month. It's the ideal time to relax and get away from the heat at home. One of those enormous floating cities with restaurants, swimming pools, and enough entertainment to keep thousands of people occupied. The ship was named the Royal Horizon. Jessica was overjoyed. Before we even got on the plane, she had already arranged our whole schedule. I needed the first 3 days more than anything else. For the first time in months, I was able to put spreadsheets and client deadlines out of my mind. We overindulged at the buffet. I even gave the rock climbing wall a go when Jessica pulled me to the dance courses. The weather was great. I had never seen the water in such a stunning hue of blue. I also felt like I could breathe for the first time. Every evening we would sit on the small balcony of our cabin, which was on deck 8, starboard side, and watch the sunset. Always smiling and asking if we needed anything, the team was amiable. I recall thinking that perhaps Jessica was correct, because everything was proceeding according to plan. Perhaps I should take more time off from work after all. With meals at the same times, activities planned minute by minute, and a soft rocking motion that allowed me to sleep better than I had in years, the ship had a certain pattern and a cozy predictability that made everything feel safe and orderly. Things began to go strange on Wednesday morning. I woke up at around 6 in the morning because I started going out on the deck before the masses showed up. The early wake-up call was always worth it for the dawn over the water. I heard voices coming from below as I was doing my routine round around deck 7. Amidst the often upbeat crew conversation, there were hushed, angry whispers. I could see at least 4 people arguing in what seemed like a combination of Spanish and English as I leaned against the railing. Another voice, unmistakably American, was saying something about keeping it quiet till we docked, while another voice repeatedly said, "No pedicure," which I understood from my high school Spanish to mean it can't be. I paused at the urgency in their voices. These were not the same crew members who had been preparing towel animals and handing us drinks for the previous 3 days. The tension in these utterances was like a dagger piercing the still morning air. The sound of footsteps, many of them swiftly moving over the metal flooring below, was what truly drew my attention. I heard big objects being hauled, machinery being moved, and what sounded like smashing or hammering. I realized this wasn't routine maintenance work when the roar reverberated up through the ship's structure. I had spent enough time aboard the ship to recognize the typical noises: the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the soft whoosh of the air conditioner, and the soft hum of the engines. This was not like the others. There was serious, almost frenzied activity taking place in areas of the ship that were off limits to passengers. I discovered that I couldn't see anything from where I was standing when I attempted to look down to see what was going on. Suddenly, as if someone had noticed me up there, the voices ceased. The cacophony had been disturbing, but the abrupt silence was more so. After a few minutes of waiting, I could no longer hear the activity, which seemed to have moved farther inside the ship. I told Jessica what I had heard at breakfast, but she dismissed it with a laugh, claiming that they were either doing routine maintenance or getting ready for a surprise event. Her positive outlook was contagious, and I nearly believed she was correct. That is, until we were eating, and I saw something strange. In the dining area, 3 crew members I had never seen previously were observing individuals, rather than clearing tables or serving food. Their name badges were distinctive, but they wore the same uniforms as the rest of the crew. These just said personnel in basic black letters, rather than the typical happy names like Antonio, Cruise Director, or Maria Guest Services. They made deliberate movements, looking at faces and making notes on tiny clipboards. For longer than was comfortable, one of them, a tall man with a tattoo on his neck that protruded from his collar, kept looking at our table. Unlike the other crew members, he did not grin or nod when I looked him in the eye. His boss patted his shoulder and gestured him to another area of the dining room, but he continued to stare. Jessica getting up to get more coffee from the buffet was the most bizarre aspect. The man with the neck tattoo approached her right away and appeared to be examining her plate, napkin, and even the chair she had been occupying. Although he was being tactful and feigning to clean the table next to ours, I could see he was researching every aspect of our location. Jessica was talking to an elderly traveler, Helen from Michigan, who was traveling with her sister when she returned. Helen spoke quickly and excitedly about something she had witnessed earlier that morning: crew personnel performing an enigmatic task down on deck 3. She claimed that only specific crew members were being allowed to pass through a part that had been completely closed off with yellow tape. I could tell Helen was truly disturbed by what she had witnessed, even if her sister Margaret rolled her eyes and claimed Helen watched too many crime shows. My gut clenched with a sense of fear I hadn't experienced since I was a child, knowing that someone else had observed strange activities. The atmosphere aboard the ship had changed entirely by Thursday afternoon. Passengers began to hear rumors that something was happening on the lower decks. Individuals were congregating in tiny groups, whispering in the corridors, and exchanging theories about what they had heard or seen. The way the personnel behaved had also altered. Even though they were still courteous, there was a tension that pervaded every exchange. Paolo, our room attendant, went white when I questioned him about the sections that were sealed off. He claimed that management had instructed them not to speak to guests about operational issues. I realized this wasn't just standard maintenance because he was truly afraid. In addition to the normal positive updates on weather and activities, the ship's daily newsletter now included a message regarding increased security measures and urged passengers to notify guest services right away if they noticed anything out of the ordinary. Everyone was monitoring everyone other in this paranoid environment because they were urging passengers to basically spy on one another. The fact that we were scheduled to dock in Cozumel the following morning was made worse by the word that afternoon that port scheduling difficulties would cause our arrival to be delayed by several hours. The intercom voice of the captain sounded so artificially happy that it was completely out of place. He kept telling us to make the most of the ship's facilities and enjoy the extra time at sea. But beneath his remarks, you could detect the tension. While Jessica and I were eating supper that night, we observed a number of guests squabbling with the guest services representatives. That afternoon, a couple demanded to know why their friend's cabin had been examined. Additionally, a different family was concerned that their teenage son had been asked where he had been in the morning. The employees repeatedly expressed regret and claimed that it was all a part of routine security protocols, but their justifications were insufficient and ambiguous. Days before, the dining room had been a hive of chatter and laughing, but now it felt uncomfortable and muted. Instead than staying for dessert and drinks as they had in the past, many were eating fast and heading off. The moment when everything became completely evident occurred on Friday morning. When I went to the deck after waking up early once more, I noticed something that made my heart race. Even in the sunshine, the lights of 3 Coast Guard ships were flashing as they approached our ship. Within an hour, officers in uniform started on board, and the captain's announcement eliminated all appearance of normalcy. He advised all passengers to maintain composure and provide their full cooperation as federal authorities conducted a normal examination. No one was duped by the word routine. A simple inspection doesn't require 3 Coast Guard cutters. Jessica's grip on my arm was so firm that I was afraid she may bruise me, and I could see the terror in her eyes, which mirrored mine. The officers dispersed systematically across the ship. In a matter of minutes, they were rapping on cabin doors, verifying identity, and inquiring about the guests' prior few days' activities. The officer was thorough yet professional when they arrived in our cabin, asking us specific questions about our whereabouts, our observations, and whether we had observed any odd behavior from the passengers or crew. When we were instructed to assemble in the main auditorium for a required briefing, it was the biggest shock. They have received credible intelligence about illegal smuggling activities on board our ship, explained the lead investigator, a tough lady in her 50s. She stated that the inquiry would go on until the guilty persons were identified, since they had proof that a member of the crew or passengers had engaged in the transportation of illicit goods. She stressed that while there was nothing to fear for innocent people, everyone will be questioned, and some parts of the ship would be closed until further notice. Except for the occasional anxious cough and the sound of individuals shifting in their chairs, the room was completely quiet. I could see the same mix of shock and astonishment on the expressions of my fellow travelers as I was experiencing. This was not intended to occur while on vacation. This was not something you experienced while attempting to unwind and forget about your troubles back home. Rather, it was the sort of thing you read about in the news. The hours that followed were a waiting and uncertain nightmare. In conference rooms that had been converted into temporary interrogation rooms, they separated us into groups, and interrogated each of us individually. The officer questioned me about everything when it was my turn. The odd crew members I'd seen, the voices I'd heard Wednesday morning, and even Helen's explanation of the restricted sections. Even though I was only attempting to assist, I felt like I was betraying people by telling them everything I could recall. My description of the crew member with the neck tattoo piqued the officer's curiosity, and he made thorough notes. They let me return to the ship's main rooms after what seemed like hours, but the mood had changed entirely. People were acting as though everyone else may be a suspect, avoiding eye contact and muttering in corners. Officers used canines and specialized equipment to search cargo facilities, crew quarters, and even passenger bags during the course of the inquiry, which lasted another full day. They finally made an arrest on Saturday night. It wasn't even a passenger. The man with the neck tattoo who had been observing our table was one of 3 crew members. They were allegedly transporting cocaine between ports by disguising the packages in legal shipments and recovering them during port pauses in the ship's cargo holds. After learning that authorities were aware of them, they had been attempting to relocate their operation to the blocked-off sites Helen had seen. They were debating whether to dump everything overboard or attempt to remove it from the ship at the next port, based on the voices I had heard that Wednesday morning. According to the inquiry, the smugglers had been utilizing their positions to coordinate with individuals at several ports and get access to prohibited areas for months. The environment of the spacecraft gradually returned to normal when the 3 crew members were removed, but the harm had already been done. We all seemed to be going through the motions until we could get home and attempt to forget what had happened, so the remainder of the voyage felt meaningless. Months later, I still reflect on how a straightforward vacation became something that caused me to reevaluate all of my preconceived notions about trust and safety. Music I had been saving for that cruise for more than a year. Something calmer, more laid back, not one of those crazy party ships. There were a few lone travelers like me on this mid-range route, but the majority were families and elderly couples. This was meant to be my much-needed break from teaching history in a middle school in New Hampshire. A kind elderly couple who reminded me of my aunt and uncle sat at my dinner table over the first few days, which were marked by a tranquil and smooth sea and good food. The ship then veered off course on the 4th morning. Word got out that someone had fallen close to the pool deck, but no notification was made at first. They hurried past the buffet on a stretcher. Seizures and strokes were whispered. Finally, at midday, the captain announced over the speakers that we would be making a quick, unforeseen stop to bring the passenger medical assistance. I had never heard of the port where we docked. It appeared to be a supply station rather than a true stop. Roris 16 was a single, long, narrow pier that led to a few dilapidated dwellings. In contrast to the other ports, there were no signs, vibrant marketplaces, or tour guides, just heavy, muggy air and an unusually strong sun. At about 2 p.m., the crew announced something, stating that, provided we remained within a specified region, we may spend a few hours on shore while the medical transfer was taking place. While the majority didn't care, some of us were intrigued and stir-crazy. I left with a small group of people, primarily elderly people, 2 teens, and Brandon, a guy the first had spoken to earlier in the week. Wearing cargo shorts and an Arizona Cardinals hat, he appeared to be in his early 30s. He was reserved yet genuine in his friendliness. The port area had the strange emptiness of a place not expecting visitors, and we strolled around it. One building contained a small bar, and another had a woman selling gum and bottled water from a cooler. There's no music, only a dusty fan circling slowly overhead. Brandon and I spent some time sitting on a bench close to the dock's edge. He joked that he wasn't sure if ocean air was making him feel better or worse after talking about how he was flying alone following a split. Around 4:00 p.m., a crew member began using a bullhorn to summon people back. Thus, we all crept in the direction of the gang path. Brandon is well in my memory. He was nodding in agreement with one of the adolescents as he walked in front of me. He was the first person to board the ship. Before I could no longer see him amid the crowd, we even briefly waved. It was an odd dinner that evening. Martin and Evelyn, the pair at my table, kept looking at an empty chair close to them. "Wasn't Brandon supposed to sit here?" Martin asked, leaning near me. I assumed he was running late, but an hour went by and he never arrived. At the time, I didn't give it much thought. On cruise ships, people frequently miss dinners. He might have been eating at the buffet or exhausted. However, the ship was bustling by sunrise. It was reported that the door to his stateroom had been left open. According to another, a steward had entered and discovered it was empty. Nothing, no bag, no clothes. Then, right before lunch, a woman by the atrium began to speak louder. She claimed to have witnessed Brandon return to the ship. In addition, 3 people immediately agreed with her. When questioned about it, the crew denied he ever reboarded, despite describing the same gray backpack and red hat. By the afternoon, the atmosphere aboard had changed from lighthearted worry to subdued anxiety. Evelyn, who had become strangely protective of Brandon despite hardly knowing him, began inquiring around, but crew members avoided direct questioning, dismissing anything about him with statements like, "We're looking into it," or "We've got protocols in place." The on-duty officer pretended to be perplexed when she told me that she had gone to the front desk and wanted to speak with security, claimed that the passenger list did not contain anyone with that name. It became odd at that point. I had no doubt that Brandon existed. I had talked to him and sat next to him. I had witnessed him re-entering the ship, but when I looked at the daily itinerary from the beginning of the vacation, none of the events we had both attended had his name on it. He appeared to have been cleaned out. Out of curiosity, I even returned to the tavern we had visited on land. Before we got back on the plane, I had snapped a brief picture in front of it. Brandon was not there when I zoomed in, but I could see a few other folks in the background. I took another look at my phone's gallery. Nothing. I remembered snapping a photo with him sitting next to me, but there was not a single picture of him. He began to play with my mind in that empty spot where he should have been. Evelyn claimed to have seen him on the first day of the lifeboat training. He lent him a charger, according to a teen group member. However, those who had only spoken to him 2 days prior were now abruptly uncertain. One woman replied, "Maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else," in a somewhat shaky voice. I wandered the upper deck late that night in an attempt to decompress. The ship was silent. Too silent. I heard something at 1:30 a.m. when I walked by a crew-only entrance next to the rear stairs. On the opposite side are slow, deliberate footsteps. I paused and waited. After a while, the steps came to a sudden halt. I took a step back and descended a level. Something was stuck beneath one of the ornamental plants as I passed the tiny library area, a badge that has been laminated. I picked it up even though it wasn't mine. I suppose it's instinct. It only contained Brandon's first name, room number, and no picture. I glanced toward the corridor. I was standing 2 doors down from his room. I paused, then went because I had to see it for myself. There was a crack in the door. It was resting there, not open or closed, as if someone had forgotten to fully close it. I gave it a light push. Even though the lights were out, the hallway's illumination was sufficient to identify the shapes inside. The bed was made just so. There were no suitcases, toiletries, bedside items, or even a key card. There is only one thing in the middle of the pillow. One of those folded napkins they offer you at the pool with your drinks. Half anticipating some stupid joke or sketch, I moved forward and grabbed it, but it was just 2 words scrawled in crooked handwriting. Don't follow. I spent far too much time standing there with a napkin in hand, attempting to figure out if this was a sophisticated practical joke or something far more serious. The napkin was gone the following morning. I kept it folded in my cabin drawer beneath my journal, even though I realized that sounds like I made it up. The drawer remained undamaged when I opened it, but the napkin was gone. I kept the staff in the dark. I was already anticipating the response. At breakfast, Evelyn and I had our final conversation. It appeared as though she had not slept at all. I hadn't given it much thought until she leaned in and asked me softly, "Did he ever tell you his last name?" It was something I couldn't recall him saying. Even the child who claimed to have borrowed his phone charger was unable to do so. For us both, that's when it clicked. Brandon's identity remained a mystery to all of us. I called the cruise line's customer service from the airport after we disembarked. I didn't circle back. I provided them with his room number, first name, description, and the fact that he had vanished. After putting me on hold for a bit, the woman on the line returned with a solid, practiced voice. "I apologize, sir, but that name was never used to register a visitor on that sailing." I pushed back and inquired as to whether someone had snuck on or whether a staff member had utilized that room. According to her, internal logs verified that the room had been vacant for the duration of the cruise. I inquired as to whether incident reports had been sent to them. She said it again. I felt as though I had slipped out of reality as I hung up. The night following, I didn't get much sleep. I couldn't get the folded napkin out of my head. I received a message from Evelyn on one of those cruise community boards a few weeks later. Something odd had been discovered by her. A 3-year-old passenger list from a different ship in the same fleet. It mentioned a Brandon C. in his early 30s who lived in the same state as the man we met. He had vanished while on a seaside excursion. His remains were never found. No one was able to verify if he reached his accommodation, but the thread she came across stated that he was last seen returning to the ship. I was completely stopped by that. It took me 3 readings to fully comprehend the post. The age, the name, and the satisfying particular. It couldn't be a coincidence because it was too exact. Nevertheless, nobody ever discussed that occurrence in public. No remark or news from the cruise line. I'm still unsure as to whether Brandon was real or if we were meant to meet someone or anything else. But what I observed is known to me. I am aware that we spoke. I recall his quiet voice, the cardinal's hat, and his uncertain expression as he gazed out across the sea. Since then, I've maintained a land vacation. I don't discuss this with others unless I'm certain they'll believe me. Every now and then, Evelyn sends me a screenshot of a cruise group post about a quiet guy in a red hat who disappeared midway through the trip. Evelyn and I still check in occasionally. Additionally, the first name is consistently the same,